So, good afternoon. So, since they placed me in the moderator's chair, so I have to start this conversation. And I suggest that we structure it as we discussed, so with the past, present, and the future. And probably we should first share our personal experience with technology becoming part of our decision-making structure. So you first?
Okay.
Okay.
So I started trading markets when I was a kid, and then 1984, the Mac comes along, and I wrote down my criteria for making decisions. I wrote down my principles. Like, if there's one message that I would want to convey to this audience, it would be, whenever you're in a situation of making important decisions, write them down as principles, your principles for making that type of decision, and then encoding them. And so what I did was I wrote down my criteria for making a trade, so that every time I would close out the trade, I would then go back and look at it. And what I discovered was, by writing it so clearly, I could see how that decision rule would have worked in the past. And then by making it very clear, I was able to pull in information from all over the world about where that same configuration of circumstances was, and I was able to then make the decision-making process. And so not only in making investment decisions, but in making all decisions about management and running my company, I found that the combination of written principles and converting those to algorithms would allow the computer to make decisions for me and in parallel with me. And so the way it works is that I'm making decisions and the computer is making decisions, but with my criteria for the most part. And then I look at them and compare. So we've put in, I don't know, hundreds of millions of dollars over many, many years to build that computer to run in parallel with our decision, and then to reconcile. If I do something that would be different than the computer would do, I go back to the criteria that are built in the computer and say, is that right or wrong? Most of the time, the computer thought in a more complex way than I'm able to think about it. Or should I change something in the programming? And that, as a result, allowed me to be successful, because I could process vastly more information, I could process it vastly quicker, and much less emotionally. So that's been my experience.
Yeah, it's while you were talking about human-machine collaboration, so it reminded me about my own experience. So naturally in chess, we had one of the first fields where machines could compete with humans, and it's quite an interesting, historical fact that the founding fathers of computer science, Alan Turing, Claude Shannon, Norbert Wiener, they all saw chess as a kind of a Drosophila fly test for machine learning. And they believed that the day when, not if, when machine would beat the strongest human players, that could be the dawn of AI. As a matter of fact, when it's happened in 1997, when I faced Deep Blue in the second match after winning the first one, and I lost the match, it was not about AI, but it was just about a brute force. And this is one of the things that I learned 20 years earlier, that is just in the 90s, is that we should not expect machines to be perfect. It's all about machines being better. And the moment you are talking about closed system, where you, as humans, we identify the targets, we create the rules, machines will eventually have a better performance, simply because they're steady hand. They make fewer mistakes. But of course, chess is not nearly as complex as business, as investment. But the lesson that I learned from 1997 match is that it's time to stop thinking about human versus machine, but looking for human-machine collaboration. So how can we find the most effective formula of synthesis of human and machine working together? And what we found out throughout these many experiments in the game of chess is that in the human-machine combination, it's not about the strongest and smartest human. It's not about the fastest a machine, but it's about the synthesis. It's about an interface. So how humans and machines could reach the best performance, while humans' role had to be to actually identify the machine's deficiencies and use this massive brute force to channel it in the right direction. So does it correlate with your experience?
Yeah, you said two things. You used two words, I think, that are important here. You dealt with human-machine collaboration, that's the first, and then you also dealt with closed systems. So I want to touch on something, and I think this is an important issue. When it has to do with deep understanding. Okay, it has to do with machine learning. When can you trust machine learning, and when can't you trust machine learning? I think as a rule, you can trust machine learning. Machine learning normally will produce algorithms. You can come up with algorithms either yourself, express them as I do, or you can have the machine come up with algorithms. Those algorithms are not readily understandable. And so when the decision is, do you trust the algorithm? I think you can trust the algorithm if you have enough sample size in a closed system. If you have a situation in which the future can be different from the past, and you don't have deep understanding to accompany the decision making, you're in a very dangerous area. So for example, in the investment area, if you come up with rules that would have worked in the past, and even others come up with rules, those same rules that would have worked in the past, they won't work in the future by definition, because anything that is known then gets bid up and reflected in the price. And then because of that, you almost could do the opposite of what can be found in the future. So the line is, when can you get away with operating without deep understanding? I think when you have the human dealing with the machine, so that there is a looking at, is there deep understanding? Can the computer help you learn and have understanding? It's a good thing. And I think it's dangerous in cases where you don't have deep understanding and the future could be different from the past.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think it's just, again, you emphasize closed system, and I think it's very important for us to actually agree on the terminology. Because I believe we're now at a time where we should agree on just in general terms. When people say AI, so what do they mean? I strongly advise to use not artificial intelligence, but augmented intelligence, because I think it's more precise in describing human-machine collaboration, but also it doesn't sound so scary. The moment you say artificial, people think about this Hollywood brainwashing production. It's about the Terminators, the Matrix, the killer robots. While I don't see any signs of machines threatening humanity yet. But doomsayers, they're running the show. It sells. And that's why at many conferences you can hear these predictions about the dark future and about the extinction of humanity, because we will never control these new machines. And I think that we just now have to stop and just to take a deep breath and just to understand exactly the subject we are discussing. And that's why the idea of the closed systems versus the open-ended systems, it's very important, because I see no way of machines automatically transferring the knowledge accumulated in the closed systems to open-ended systems, which still remains a human domain, how to ask the questions and how to identify the targets and create the limitations. Do you agree?
So yeah, I think the main issue is, where does the algorithm come from? Because it can come from your brain, or it can come from quote machine learning. And the way that I found it to be very effective is to take a really intelligent person and put a great coder, great engineer next to that person, and have that partnership so that thinking could be expressed rather than just in words, but in this new language, which is so important that everybody in the new generation speaks, which is code. So you can take words and you can put it into code and bring that about as a very effective way. If there's not a closed system, you can then still do terrific algorithms. The power of that is enormous. I think it's particularly true of our generation, because when we were growing up,
When you say
we
our
did.
generation, it's this. We're talking about our
Well,
generation.
I think
Yes,
I
yes.
think it's true of
Yeah.
it's true of people who have learned a lot, but don't know how to code.
Yeah.
And
yes,
if-
that's a good description.
Okay. So there's many people who are wise and have learned things and don't know how to code. And if you put somebody next to them and convert their principles for making good decisions into code, then magic happens. That has been my path, and that's why I pass it along with everybody. I'm also comfortable with machine learning if I know it's a closed system. But if I know the future can be different from the past, I want to go the other route. I want to bring in that wisdom, because I think that's and it's a wonderful way to create learning, because we found that by making these algorithms crystal clear so everybody can understand them, it produces terrific learning. The understandability of algorithms is a tremendously powerful force.
I think, again, you mentioned our generation, and I think that's what you said is actually could give hope to our generation, to people, yes, in 40s and 50s and 60s.
People who don't know how to put it into code.
Exactly, because this is one of the biggest fear now. It's job loss. So there will be millions and millions of jobs that will be chopped on the block of automation.
Of course.
And I think that is just it's a natural process. It happened with agriculture. It happened with blue-collar jobs. It's happening with white-collar jobs. One of the reasons for last few decades we have been teaching new generations, the educated class, how to work like machines. And now many of these jobs, they will be redundant because the amount of human creativity, median human creativity required for the work activities is minimal. I think according to McKinsey studies of 2016 U.S. job market, it's 4%. So I think that what you said is just, demonstrates that there will be room for even for people that are not great experts in coding and not so savvy with this technology to use their wisdom and their ability to strategize, their creativity to become part of this new workforce. Is it true?
Yes, yes and no, I guess I would say. I think what the ability of what's happening now is the question of where is the human superior. And the area that the human is superior in is shrinking at a very fast pace, and that's causing job loss, and that will continue to cause job loss. And yet at the same time, if you have coding education at a very early age and build coding, and you have that working together with people who don't know coding but have learned a lot, I think that that's the new most powerful employment. And economics is what I study, employment is what I study. I don't think there's a good plan for that. I think that has to do with the educational system. We're going into other domains. I'm not optimistic about the unemployed being able to fill in that gap and to be able to be in that position. So I do think that we will replace that this productivity. We will replace it, and you will not have good opportunities for a lot of people having to do with the way the education system is and the way that people are working together. I hope it happens, but I think that it's an issue of our time. It's connected to populism. It's connected to the wealth gap. It's connected to many things that I think machine learning will shrink the number of people who are employed.
You said that there was no good plan. I don't see even a bad plan. I see no plan addressing the issues that you have described. I think that's one of the problems that the society now just it's from different angles that looks at the problems separately. Social problems, financial problems, political problems, technological problems, job markets. While I think we should start understanding that in the globalized world, they all are intertwined. They all are connected.
I agree. That's what leadership is about. A leader should say we have a wealth gap. We have a gap here. We have a technology that is producing productivity. And how do we take that in the best possible way so that capitalism works for the majority of the people? Capitalism does not right now work for the majority of people, unfortunately, and I'm a professional capitalist, and it makes me difficult to say that, but we need leadership and metrics so that there is that, and it connects to the education system, it connects to many things.
Then I have to ask you a provocative question. So you said capitalism is not working for majority of people. I couldn't agree more. But is it because capitalism is failing us, or is it because we're failing capitalism by violating the fundamental rules of the free market?
Well, it's because of a number of structural things. First, it's that we're replacing people with technology. Secondly, the wealth gap is a function of also central banks printed $15 trillion of assets, drove asset prices higher. People who hold assets did well in relationship to those that did not. You have a situation in the United States. The Federal Reserve did a survey. 40% of Americans could not raise $400
for medical emergency. Yes.
In an emergency. The top 0.1% of the population's net worth is equal to 90% combined. That money and that opportunity stays with them. If you look at then education system, education in the United States, there's a constitution, so it's a state issue. Then it goes to the tax district. So richer tax districts have better education systems. There are large parts of the United States. I live in Connecticut. Connecticut is the richest state in the United States. But it's one segment is very rich and the rest of it is poor. My wife helps in public school system to help the most disadvantaged. There's two groups, disengaged and disconnected youth. Disengaged student is a student who attends a public school and doesn't learn. They just are attending, they don't study. Disconnected is they don't know where they are. 22% of the students in Connecticut, high school students, are one of those. Those students are going to be not only without jobs, they won't graduate high school, they will be without education. So the polarity of this has a lot of reasons. Partially it's that how do you develop the education system? It requires leadership. It requires the definition that this is an emergency and that we should create metrics. In other words, what is that percentage? And then through other programs, I would say through microfinance, through many other programs of education, there should be changes, because if we don't have those, when we have the next economic downturn, we're going to have a clash between the rich and the poor. We're talking about the 1930s.
But you just mentioned next economic downturn. So roughly when do you expect that?
I think we're 9 years into the expansion. We're at the part of the expansion in which, because of unemployment rates being lower and so on, that they touch the brakes. Central banks are tightening monetary policy. So it would probably be between 1 and 3 years from now.
Yeah. But again,
and then imagine what that's like. If we have polarity now, and populism now and that clash, imagine what it'll be like when you have the next economic downturn.
But again, speaking about technology and the gap, the wealth gap. So going back to, let's talk about America now. 150 years, 100 years ago, we had technology, aggressively, replacing jobs and helping people just, to build new industries. The gap between Rockefeller and JP Morgan and the working class was pretty big as well. But somehow the capitalism has been working for bigger and bigger segments of the society. Not for all, but you could see the expansion of the circles where people could feel the benefits. Now it seems to me that it's a shrinking pie.
That's right. There was the building of the middle class.
Yeah.
In other words,
and now it's a shrinking of middle class.
That's right. There was the building of the middle class from the 30s war years and the post-World War period. So you could see the gap that existed in the late 30s narrowed, but mostly filled in with that middle class because they were in manufacturing jobs and the like. Okay. Then we're seeing, as the advent of technology, and then with central banks' monetary policies, which they had to do, that caused the widening of the wealth gap again. And so we have an extremity of the wealth gap as a result of those things.
So now, okay, looking into the future, so can we expect technology to help us to sort of to heal these problems, or it will be used, as we could see now in the United States or in Europe, throughout the whole world, where new tools in social media that help radicals on both sides to amplify their aggressive, destructive messages?
I think that how technology will be used will very much depend on the country that you're in. And I think it's a big, big issue. Okay, technology, data, big data and big technology, powerful force. That decision will be made more as a bottom-up decision in the Western world and more as a top-down decision, for example, in China, because there's a different culture. So in China, for example, there will be the collection of all data, free collection of all data in that place.
With paying no respect to privacy laws.
There will be, right. Now, that's what one thinks of that is a question of a pro and a con. If you were Chinese leadership and you say, listen, I want the best technology, I want the best information power, let me gather all of that, forget about privacy,
raw data.
but I know all data, and let me turn loose AI on all of that data to make our society as efficient as it possibly be.
It's like an oil, yes? You can just, you have more and more, fuel.
Well,
actually.
the more data you have,
Exactly,
and the more you are free to analyze it and how it relates to each other, the more you're going to get a better result of managing that. So that's
statistically, yes.
Statistically,
exactly,
right?
yes,
I'm
absolutely.
just trying. Let me explain. So So that'll be a top-down decision. One of the Chinese leaders described to me how the essence of the difference in China and the United States, I think in a very well way, which will be bottom up. He said, well, you in the United States value the individual and individualism. And that's why you have individual property rights. If you want to build a highway some way and it's bothering it'll stand in the way of individual property rights. It'll be difficult to do that because you'll do that. We in the United States and China view the primary organization or the unit as the family. He said that the word country is two Chinese characters, state, family. And so him, in a leadership position, views it paternally, and it's going to come top down. And so now you're going to have an issue of how data is going to be handled by companies, that it'll either be individuals or companies that are largely, predominantly in the West, going to make that decision of how data is handled. Whereas in China, which is a competitor in that space, Europe is not much of a competitor if you look at the statistics or so on. It's China and the United States in that technological race. That top down is going to be made top down, and that's how technology will be handled.
Okay, but now this is speaking about U.S.-China competition of the 21st century. It's the called cyber war. So how do you cyber race? How do you describe it?
I've studied through an economic lens the last 500 years of history very, very carefully, and there are cycles of what makes a country ascend and so on. It always starts with technology. Like if you go back to the Dutch, okay, the Dutch were the dominant world power, accounted for half of all trade in the world. Their technology was to be able to build boats that could go all around the world, and they put on those guns, and then the world was their oyster, and they counted for half of trade. And each time there's a technology that makes them richer and makes them successful, and that's a dominant thing. So technology cuts the end. If you win the technology race, the technology in war, the technology in anything. So we're going to have this technology competition that is leading that. And it's certainly going to be competition in a lot of other ways. History has shown in the last 500 years that we're in a situation where when you have an established power at the end of a war, some established power brings about a peace. And the reason you have a peace is because no one wants to fight the established power. That's why at the end of World War II, the United States had nuclear weapons, a monopoly in those, and the United States had the world's reserve currency, 80% of the world's gold. That's why the United Nations is in New York, and the World Bank and the IMF are in Washington. And so you had an era dominated by the United States. We now have a situation in which we have that kind of rivalry developing, and it's developing in a number of areas. Geopolitically, it's developing, and technology is at the forefront of that.
Yeah, but okay, but just it's can we have just an idea about a brighter future so that the free world still stands a chance? Because at the end of the day, we keep inventing new technologies. The advantage on the Chinese side, as you just now so vividly explained, is that access to data, whether it's on the internet or in genomics, they can actually apply all the ideas invented in the free world and put them into this massive machine of state-controlled data.
I think it, like history has shown, in that 500 years when there's a rising power challenging the existing power, in 12 of those times there were wars of some form. 4 times there weren't. A lot depends how the countries are with each other during that particular period. In other words, I don't like a trade war as distinct from a trade negotiation.
We are going to trade
wars.
We're
beyond the trade war. Okay, we're beyond the trade war. We're beyond the trade war. This goes way beyond trade. This goes back to questions in terms of other forms of conflict. And so economically, it can affect supply lines because, in other words, both countries are actually thinking about the possibility of should they have independent supply lines? Should those things that are being produced in China be instead produced in the United States for independence? And that covers cut supply lines. Yet things like, should Chinese students be educated in American universities, are questions that are actually occurring. So you're having this division take place now in many, many ways. That trade war affects capital flows. In other words, if you're Chinese, would you be comfortable investing in the United States? Because you can have economic sanctions that could threaten that investment. And so there are these types of other wars that go way beyond tariffs and other things that are entering the picture.
So I think to summarize it, because we're running out of time now, is that it's the free world needs a plan. As we discussed, in this last 27 minutes, is that the lack of a plan, a lack of the vision, strategy puts us in the disadvantageous position. Is it correct?
But the only way you get a plan is you get great leadership.
So, okay,
and we have
at the
polarity.
End of the day, it's about political leadership that can tie all the loose ends and present people with a plan that they can approve or disapprove.
That's right. And that is if you hope for a better world. You also have to think individually, how do you take care of yourself in that world? And that's a whole other subject.
But are you confident that if the free world still has strategic long-term advantage over unfree world?
It has the unique creativity. I think what's unique about the United States, myself, is that it brings in all types of people. You live in New York. It brings in a diversity. It's a country of immigrants that work well together in a creative environment. There's rule of law. There's all of those things. That's the uniqueness. Somebody that I know is, I won't mention, but works at the top of both worlds in technology. He says in that world, the United States is a very competitive world. When you have that freedom, that creativity, it's fantastic. On the other hand, when you're having the supply of engineers, he was describing what it's like to build an important tech company in China. And he says there's a wealth of engineers and so on. And there's also a developing of an enterprise system. So there's entrepreneurship that's taking place in China for a great deal of creativity. I think the answer is it depends on how each operates. If there are more economic reforms in China and more freedom within that constraint, which is what's happening, that's going to be effective. It has to do with the quality of our education, the quality of our infrastructure. You can look at economies. Is the education system great or is it not great? So that takes leadership. And I think that there are challenges with that.
Okay, I think we can summarize as saying that the future is self-fulfilling prophecy, and everything is in our hands. Thank you.
It's going to be interesting.
Yes.